Hi, my name is James Hughes, and I would like to welcome you to the How to Build Your Revit Library from Ongoing Projects presentation. ATG is a platinum level Autodesk software provider, and a platinum partner is someone who has the best customer service, best technical support by a mile, and best customer retention across authorized resellers. I want to give a special thanks to the Resource Center at AIA St. Louis. And we appreciate you guys driving awareness for today's talk and joining ATG in bringing valuable resources to architects. If you are a member of the AIA, this continuing education webinar is worth 1 LU. Yay. Well, don't get too carried away. You got 18 of them to earn here before the end of the month. And if you would like ATG to report your LU promptly to the AIA, please email events@atgusa.com. Be sure to include your name, your company, and your AIA member number. Let me take just a minute to tell you guys a little bit about myself. I'm a licensed architect in the state of Arkansas and a member of the Arkansas AIA. Before working with ATG, I have 13 years of architectural experience. But for the past 6.5 years, I've been an AEC industry specialist with ATG. So my full-time job is helping architects, interior designers, engineers, contractors, landscape architects with Autodesk software, as well as a number of other technical services. I'm sure they will come up through the process of this discussion, some of the services that I specialize in. One of the services that I specialize in is assisting firms in curating their Revit libraries. And in fact, 3 days a week, I'm delivering the service. So it's actually very fresh on my mind, the effort, the organization, and the intentionality that's required to do this well. Sadly, there are very few firms who have an organized Revit library where users can find families, details, schedules, and views. I know this because I ask people, and we also have these conversations around, what's the state of your Revit template? What are the state of your families? And so I'm basically just constantly polling firms, and it's pretty rare that someone's actually proud of their Revit library. One of my coworkers, Brian Weeks, is on here. He may actually have a little bit different experience. Brian, if you have anything else, you also can add it in chat. Brian's a contemporary of mine as well with ATG. So because very few firms have a library that they're proud of, it's very hard for their users to find families, details, schedules, and views. And so if they're unable to find them in the Revit template and they can't find them in an organized database, what that means is that your users spend a devastating amount of time out in the wild to procure content from various sources. I perform business process assessments from time to time. And, part of that is, we're brought in as a consultant, and I'll interview users and ask them questions about where do you go to procure family content? So if it's not in the Revit library, where's the first place you go? Write those answers down. One of the other questions that I like to ask is, how many hours per week do you spend procuring Revit content, or fixing it before you place it in the project? And if you want a scary number, ask that. Well, actually, if you ask that question, particularly if you're an owner or you're an associate, you're not going to get a straight answer. They're like, oh, I don't waste any time. It's basically, I just think it and it's in the project. But if you're an outside consultant and you're there to help, people will get honest with you. And some of the honesty that I've gotten in those interviews was a wake-up call for me personally to help firms become much, much more deliberate about improving the process by which that they grow and organize the Revit libraries. This talk will focus a little bit more on growing a library more so than organizing. But as the first Indiana Jones movie, which you see on screen there, has taught us, or reminds us, amassing a large amount of valuable items can still present challenges in locating them. In addition to my years of experience helping firms with organizing their content, I spent a few months further researching it, and I wrote a comprehensive white paper on this subject back in February. I told you guys it was a wake-up call for me. I felt the need to write a paper about it. So I bolstered that with a lot of research. I wanted to know what the best practices were, and I wanted to also be able to present alternative ways. So if you're not a firm with means to buy whatever software tool you need, what could you do? So this white paper is a soup to nuts approach to the process, and it's complete with an order of operations, as well as a review of multiple approaches and software solutions that can help automate each part of the process. The white paper is titled How to Train Your Revit Library, and it's available to help you for free on ATG's website. There's a link to it on screen, and I'll share this link again at the end of the presentation. This webinar examines 2 of the chapters of that paper. And so today we'll talk about the problem. We'll talk about how to build a Revit library. And we'll talk about how to start or improve your QA/QC process. And kind of the main crux of this is how to harvest families from an ongoing project, different strategies for that. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to organize Revit system files. So that's kind of a different process than the ones that you save out as .rfa files. My main objective is to discuss the available methods for building your Revit library. There's a lot of hangups to this process. It's kind of why most firms aren't engaged in it. And we're going to talk about those problems here in just a minute. But there's a lack of organization and quality management to the whole process. There's a lot of misconceptions by BIM managers or advanced Revit users about what they can do during company time without racking up too much overhead. They also don't want to bite off more than they can chew, because this tends to be one of those problems that is way more time than you think it is whenever you start, or you think it's bigger than it actually is until you can kind of wrap your arms around it. I want to give you all of the tools that you need to develop a game plan and resolution around the action steps you'll need to take. If your firm has had great success for harvesting families from ongoing projects, Brian or others, be thinking about how you might summarize a description of what you're doing that's working well for you. And at the end of our presentation, we would all love to hear from you guys in the chat about what you're doing that's working. We'll come back to that later. All right, so here we have an immaculate closet with nothing inside of it. It's kind of a shame, isn't it? Let's talk about some of the problems we're up against. Right off the top, most firms, not your firm, most firms have a lack of usable Revit families. And that lack of them causes us to go out and procure families that are made freely available from the work of others. Another problem we're up against is that your firm, probably 40% of the ones that I deal with, 60% of the ones I deal with do not have enough families in the Revit template. There are a number that have the right amount, I would say. I do a lot of template reviews, and Brian does these too. Man, I haven't done a template review that was less than a 19-page paper full of things that I would change about the template. I mean, it's just, there's so much you could do with a template that people just aren't kind of paying attention to. They're kind of bringing over their title block and putting some families in there and making sure they've got their core standards. But, there's so much more you could do to make your team efficient. And so, if nobody's looked at your template to sort of see whether or not you're doing things well, you should contact, ATG, and they can get someone like Brian or myself to help you guys out, or other team members. So we tend to not have enough families in our template. There are some firms that put like every piece of content in their template, and that's wrong too. And so the gold standard that I use, and just to help you guys out when you're gauging which families belong in the template, is, am I almost certainly going to use this piece of content in a standard project? And if the answer is yes, that family belongs in your template. If the answer is not almost certainly going to use it, but it's a great family, we need the world needs this. Well, if you're not almost certainly going to use it, it doesn't go in the template. You need to organize that in a different way. And there's multiple ways you can do that, and we'll talk through some of those. All right, here's another problem. Your coworkers, not you, but your coworkers, are wasting time going to previous projects. That's actually the worst one. To manufacturers' websites, to BIM Object, to Revit City, to God knows where else they're going. And they are burning time doing that. When I told you guys that I had a wake-up call in sort of counseling or consulting, sometimes it is counseling, I meant consulting, and asking those questions about where they're going and how much time they're spending. The number that scared the firm the most was in one of the architecture firms, they were spending 8.2 hours per week going and procuring content. That means Monday's gone. You're actually just working Tuesday through Friday, because Monday we're spending going around to places looking for stuff to be able to use. Now, truthfully, you're not spending that time having to create it from scratch. So it's not like that time is lost, but there are grave inefficiencies in that process, particularly if you're going to previous projects for things. And so anything that we can do in those 8.2 hours per week to gain efficiency across all the users in your firm is a really big deal. So we need to be thinking about efficiencies that we can gain in that space. Another problem that we're going to talk about is, and I regret that I put this at the bottom because it's actually a really big deal, and that is there's a problem of perception. Your users, your power users, your people that could do this work have a perception that if they spend time saving families, that's probably really tedious, and or it is perceived as overhead. And that's a good question, for your firm's leadership to discuss. Is it really overhead? Is it just lost money? Or is this what, other industries call a continuous process improvement? Is this spending $1 so we're not costed $5? Because is that found money? Is that worthwhile? So we need to address that perception issue as well. All right, let's talk about building a library. A lot of firms spent, let's say, 20 years building AutoCAD content. And one of the other things I do, and Brian does too, is helping firms to be able to transition from AutoCAD to Revit. You would think everybody had made that transition. And yes, about 90% of the industry has. But that's still very much a lively discussion I'm involved in day to day. And I would say about a third of those firms that are trying to mitigate risk and make that transition still are under the assumption that they can generate 20 years worth of library content in Revit before they transition over. And it's hard to tell them, no, you will not. It takes time. And that's kind of the crux of this talk, is how you can do that over time, just as a natural course of delivering your projects and then saving out families from that in a methodical checklist way. All right, we also need, and this is just a phenomenon here, actually, curated libraries acquire content much faster. When you look at this closet, it is just gorgeous, with all that stuff. I would actually spend time in this closet. And an interesting thing happens if you've got a highly organized system and you've got great content there and you've got great standards. You will find that the velocity at which you accrue content is accelerated, as opposed to not having a great process, not having great distribution of the content. It's nobody's job. It's, there's no standards. If you have breakdowns in kind of any of those parts of it, you don't develop content quickly. And the normal speed that you're going to accrue content is when a power user like myself or Brian or one of you guys that's a power user develops or authors a piece of content from scratch in the family editor, and you're really proud of it. Like Brian created this bank vault door a week ago, just a gorgeous thing, but that's not something that a power user does, every day. That's just a piece that you put in your portfolio and you're like, check this out. But when you do those big ticket items, you tend to save out that .rfa family, and very slowly you might accumulate, but that's a very specialized piece of content. If your firm isn't designing bank vaults every day, you're not going to benefit that much from saving that out. So it tends to be a slower rate, and it tends to be done by your power users when they create something really neat. The problem is most of the content that we use as architects or interior designers or just designers isn't content that we authored from scratch. It's normally something that we got from somewhere else that's really close, and we've modified it to fit our needs. And we need continuous access to that, so we don't have to keep going out into the wild to find it. I use the term Revit Jedi in this third point. I'm just searching for a term to use. Your power users is probably what I should have said, but typically your Revit Jedi, as I called it here, they're going to save out those RFA files when they make a neat piece of content. That's what I was just describing. Here's another thing that happens, and maybe I should have listed this under the problems, but when you're building a library, if you don't have an organized process and you don't have an organized distribution scheme, maybe you've got standards or something, your users will tend to squirrel away content. For instance, if I know Brian did a bank vault door half a year ago, and I haven't done a bank project before, but I ask him about it and he tells me to go look up whatever bank project. And then I go to look that up. If I spend some time looking for it, let's say I spend 40 minutes in contacting Brian and waiting till he can respond and then going and searching his project, there's an incredible amount of time that gets burned looking through previous projects. I want to shorten that and to be efficient in myself, because my BIM manager or my leadership or nobody has created a system to distribute this content. I'm going to plug in an external hard drive and say, I'm making a bank folder and I'm going to tuck this away for me. And that's now going to be one of the things that makes me faster and makes me more efficient. If you have users that are doing this and you know that, that is a condemnation of your process. You have failed to provide your team a means to be able to distribute content easily. And the benefit of that, though, not the benefit of failing them, but once you implement something, you will be able to invite your users, or maybe even incentivize your users, to plug their external hard drives into that, let's say, content management solution, and have it scarf that content up. And you can actually jump ahead of where you think you'll be on the schedule, at least in the early stages. All right. QA QC process. Our next slide, we're going to spend talking a little bit more about that, but it's something that architects really don't focus on. And so I want to talk about a QA QC process we can apply to this particular thing of harvesting families from ongoing projects. We also need to leverage a peer review QA QC process. Let me jump to the next slide and we'll go ahead and explain that. Now, I keep saying QA, QC. The infographic that I downloaded happens to be QC, QA. So just note that quality control is on the left. It's not on the right. So I'll try to refer to them by color here. But as I said, it's an unfamiliar process to architects, but it deals not just with a service, but also a product. So most of the people that are developing QA, QC processes are doing that to ensure that they are not delivering a defective product, but it also applies to software. It applies to services that you guys deliver as well. So QA, or quality assurance, shown there in teal, that can be accomplished in this realm by simply having a different set of eyes peer review your families and your other work. You guys hopefully are already doing this with your projects before they go out of the office. But man, I ask that question sometimes and firms are like, if we have time, which is code for no, we don't. Who has the time? That's one you better make the time for. I'll just offer that up to you. At a minimum, have QA on your projects before they go out. The same thing should be applied to harvesting families. You need to have a different set of eyes look at it. It's one thing if you have your project manager look at their own project before it goes out the door, right? They're not going to catch things that they certainly have the competency to catch because they've been looking at it or it's theirs. But when you have a second set of eyes, they see things freshly. They see things from a lens of how would I do this? And they don't assume that you did things correctly. They look at it like, is it there? Does this set of plans tell the story of the building properly? Or is it missing, an extra partial building section through the entrance? Sorry, I should get back to my family centric things. All right. If you have good families, you need to make them better. So don't just start with what you have in a heap or in a pile and say, here's our starting kernel, and then we'll add to this. Hopefully you have standards, not just standards for your Revit template. You need standards for your families so that you don't end up with really large families, really broken families that it doesn't matter if you put it on coarse, medium, or fine. They look the same no matter which one you put it on. Or families that don't have your shared parameters, so they don't schedule properly and don't tag properly. There is work, just basic work that you need to do to make sure that they are good families. But even if you have good families, there's a way to make them smarter. If you issued a challenge to Brian Weeks, who's on here, and said, Brian, these are great families. They're not just good. These are great families. I don't think you could make them much better. I bet Brian could. I bet Brian could surprise you with, taking some of your filled regions and turning them into detailed components so that they keynote properly, getting rid of some of your lines. He's probably going to find that some of your details have .dwg after it. He's just going to be like, oh boy. And this is in the Revit template. This is awful. But if you've got families that you've created, there's ways to save out different types and adjust visibilities. Well, here's some examples here too on point number 5 here. You can standardize naming. Don't get crazy with that because a lot of firms that get very authoritarian, let's say, with their naming schemes, the BIM manager is the only one that it makes sense to, and everybody else thinks it's a crock. Why do we have to name everything? It doesn't sort the way I would sort it. So be careful. Make sure that that's a democratic process whenever you go to rename things. But also when you're looking for families, if you have jumped into the age of content management solutions, how you name the families doesn't matter as much, because increasingly those searches are based around tags that your users can add. So if they're looking for a fluorescent light and the Arkansas education system has failed them and they spell it flowerescent instead of putting the U before the O, then they could add a tag, in something like a CMS like Hive. They could add a tag for fluorescent that will help them find that easier. And then increasingly, these are developing algorithms to be able to search better, to learn the things that you actually care about. So getting the name exactly right in a sequence doesn't matter as much if you're kind of fast forwarding to the content management solution era that the industry has kind of jumped into for the last year and a half, honestly, since right at COVID starting. That's what your competition has kind of been doing. We can also add visibility controls. So those typically are yes/no controls that turn something on or off. For instance, if you have 2 handicap symbols that you need to use for a parking space, and some of them use the active handicap symbol, this was a change that I made to smarten up a family recently, where you could have both of the symbols superimposed one on top of the other. And depending on which type you chose, it would turn on the visibility of one and not the other. But it gives your users the choice to just toggle it and not have to go out in the wild or a previous project to try to track down some new handicap symbol that hopefully somebody made. If-then formulas. Ooh, this one it can be tricky. When you create, you guys have probably experienced it when you download a manufacturer's content. Well, I'll give you a better example. If you had a ladder family that has a parametric array, and as you stretch the ladder longer, it keeps adding in extra rungs every 1 foot. There's an inherent problem with that family that it works as long as your ladder is, let's say, 2 feet long. If you stretch it shorter, it's going to have an error. It's going to break. But you could create an if-then statement that basically you take one of the dimensions that's tied to length and you write a formula in it that simply says, if length is less than 2 feet, then, then 2 feet. And that way, if I try to stretch it down to 1 foot, Revit will say, okay, how about 2 feet? And so Revit will basically keep me from breaking the family. And that would be an example of an if-then control that you could write in. If you'd like some guidance with that, ATG writes these kind of things all the time. Don't make a Swiss watch out of this thing, though. we tend to do that with manufacturers who contract us to create families. They want to protect it from every way you could break it. Just use it in moderation if you're into if-then. You can put in keynote values. So you can actually pre-keynote elements so that all your users just simply have to point to things. You might need to add shared parameters to some of your families to make them tag well, to make them schedule appropriately. You've probably had customers that have an increasing appetite for different or more data that they would like to see scheduled. And your firm over the years has been adding shared parameters, I hope, to start tracking that. So your door schedules probably are a little bit smarter. Your finish schedules probably track a few more things than they used to years ago. You need to make sure that your families show differently with symbolic lines and coarse, medium, and fine setting visualizations. If you've got a door that maybe has 20 different or 21 different ways that it can be configured and shown, you don't want to create 21 different types of the door, because then that becomes difficult in itself to search or to differentiate. How is this door trim a little bit different than this other door type? And so you might end up creating a type catalog at that point. And typically we recommend that you look at creating a type catalog. If you've got 20 plus variants of it, then that's worth looking into. Those are some examples of how you can take your existing families and make them smarter. It's not really what this talk is centered around, but I wanted to give you guys some tools to go after that content, which is scary. I mean, if you've got 200 plus, I mean, who knows? Most of the firms that contract us to do work, we ask them, okay, let's put a scope together. How many families do you have? And they're like, we should probably know that. We don't even know how many, because our users have been overriding them, and we don't know which ones are junk and which ones are duplicates and which ones are in the wrong folder. And, but if you've got hundreds of families, that's daunting. And so you do need to try to at least wrap your arms around how big of a job it is, based around and where the deficiency are in your library, according to about how many families are in each, let's say, CSI division, if you want to think of it in those terms. All right. Let's talk about QC then. So quality control, as you can see in yellow over there, it's not done by everybody. Quality assurance should be done by all of your team members, or at least all of your PMs. They need to make sure that the families that were kicked out of the project are up to standard. And so they should have a checklist to be able to run through. If you just absolutely don't think your PMs could do that, and you don't want to train them up to be able to do that, you could take some of that and just have your PMs kick out the families and then just wash their hands of it. There, I gave you every family was in it. I don't know anything about quality. Then you could put all of that on quality control. But quality control is focused around fixing what's wrong with the project. So in an ideal world, your PMs could, as part of the standard deliverable, they could save out all of the families that were used in the project. They could run a checklist against them to find out the deficiencies, an automated way to do that. So it's not just dependent upon what they happen to be paying attention to or their expertise. They can just run software and check a box or write a thing about what needs to be fixed. Quality control is about fixing it. So here we're going to focus reactively to fix things that are deficient in it. And then we're going to test it. So we're going to test it beforehand to make sure that it is deficient. We're going to execute the change, and then we're going to test it to make sure that we did fix that. And then we're going to host that family live, as it were. If you want to automate that process, and I'm trying to stay away from too many software recommendations. And if you want to look at the white paper, it's going to kind of just list everything along with screenshots of these. So I promise I'm not pulling up, I'm sorry, I'm not pulling up, 6 pieces of software to kind of demonstrate each of these. But there is a CTC tool called Family Checker that can automate this process. It basically, and you can point it to a folder of like 200 families and have it generate 200 Excel report cards on each of those families. And it's going to check about 42 things on that family. It's got an extremely high bar of excellence, but that doesn't mean you have to fix it up to that point. So it can apply the BIM object standards. Like if you're going to have a family that's hosted on BIM object, it can't be, some Revit City kind of sus content. It's got to be up to a certain level. Sorry, Revit City, to throw you under the bus. I'm not mad at you. You've saved us all hundreds of thousands of hours. But BIM Object's got a high standard for curation, and that also gets applied whenever you run Family Checker. But you're not going to want to fix everything that it flags. What you want to do is cross-reference that with your standards and your checklist, your QC checklist, and say, this actually is a problem. I don't care that it's not got visibility for coarse, medium, and fine. Could care less about that. But we are going to fix this because, this part is broken. Then what you can do is inside of that Excel report card that it generates in that folder, you can have, one of your QC managers or your BIM managers review that, and then just type in the actionable thing that needs to happen to that family before it's up to standard. And when you've done that, you have turned the corner, because And that's an automated process, right? It's just you still need to open it up, figure out what's a big deal, what's a not. It's basically triage. So you might find a terrible report card and you're like, geez, this is an hour and a half, 2 hours worth of work. That's part of triage to say that ain't worth it. We don't need a pool table that bad. It's that broken. We'll find something else, or we'll just extrude a rectangle. And so you might start over with a different family. You might go on, and that's valuable information. You would type that in. We need to find another pool table that does these things. And then at some point, you can follow a phased schedule of the families that you need corrected most, and then execute on that QC checklist. All right. Quality control ensures that quality changes are made in the deliberate execution of a plan. So this isn't just me opening up a family behind you and saying, is this family okay? Looks okay. And then randomly testing some stuff. This is, we have a checklist of things that we need to test, or hopefully we've automated that. And now I can turn the corner and write exactly what needs to be fixed. And then we're in business. All right. This is where we need to spend a little bit more of our time, which is harvesting families. And that's kind of what this talk is about. All right. So we want to make sure that this is part of our design checklist. And this is the best piece of advice that I can give you here. If you guys have struggled at curating content or developing it at any respectable rate, this should be, in my estimation, a job of your PM. They should have some personal ownership in that project. And they should either export out their hero families that they created or that they found and modified. At a minimum, they should be doing that. But I think that they ought to export everything out of it, just as part of project closeout. So at the end of construction documents, when I want to print everything out and say I've sent it out of the office, hopefully you guys are kind of archiving the files. You're maybe doing some things with your design options. You're probably adding in some things for addendums, change orders, that kind of thing. At that point in time, before it's archived, I would have them run through, part of the checklist is how to save out the families. And it can either be very manual or it can be very automated. And we've kind of listed a few approaches on the screen here. So make it part of your project closeout that your PMs are expected to do. Problem is that's got to come from leadership. So if you have leadership's ear, you need to tell them, look, this has been a continuous problem. We've tried doing it this way for 10 years and we don't have hardly any library to speak of, or we've got a mess and we need to tidy this thing up. We need to start having a process, and the project managers know the project better than your BIM manager does. They know the content that needs to be used for the team, or the team needs to have access to. All right. So there's a manual method of doing this. Most people know kind of about this, but they don't do it. And a lot of people don't know how powerful this is. So our manual method is to do file, save as, library, family, all families. It's important enough. Let me show you real quick. Jump over into Revit. We'll go, this is just a sample project that comes with Revit. I'm a lazy PM. I don't know which hero project or hero families were involved in this, but my checklist says to manually save out all the families that came out of this project and put them in X folder. I can do that. We go to File, Save As, Library, Family. And check this out. If you leave this on defaults, it's defaulting to all families. We're going to do this. Hopefully it won't take too long. We'll create a new folder on the desktop and we'll call it Revit stuff. Hopefully your naming conventions are better than me hustling through this. And by default, it wants to name each of the families that it spits out according to the very same name that they are using inside of Revit. And so I'm going to leave both of these as they are and just simply hit save. And if you look in the bottom left, I see a progress bar, and Revit is taking about, 1.5, 2 seconds per family, packaging it up, spitting out a .rfa file into that folder. This is a handsome way of doing it. And because it's not just going to be asking an exhausted PM at the end of their shift to say, all right, which families did you come up with that were great that we need to add to the library? Oh gosh, maybe the elevator and 2 others. No, this is spitting out probably like 100 families right now. Okay. So instead of me harvesting 4 families that I happen to think of off the top of my head, it's going to grab a lot of stuff. Now, there's probably going to be 2/3 redundancy with existing families that we already have. So we need to be able to solve that problem too by doing this manually. There's some other problems to this too, but yeah, and this family broke, so that's awesome. All right, we got a light source problem. I might write that number down if I wanted to find that file or that family here in the project. I don't care because I'm just making a point. So I'm going to hit OK and let it keep chucking along. All right, so this is going to save out every file. I'm not going to have a sit and watch that. I'll let it kind of keep churning here while I continue to make great points here. So that's the manual way to do it. One of the shortcomings of this way is it's going to put every family in the same folder and make no distinction about what kind of family it is or how it's different from other ones. It's a little untidy, but man, it got everything. So it's hard to be mad at that process, right? And it's free, so it's hard to be mad at that too. Here's another way to do it. CTC Family Exporter is a tool that you could get. Actually, I think this one's free. And what it lets you do is the same thing where it pushes every family out, but it gives you a couple of other tools. I think the most important one is it's able to look at the category of Revit family and make a subfolder with that category name. And that's awesome. I mean, just putting all the lights in a lights folder, thank you. Worth it. And it also gives you a chance to manually rename things as you go along. So if you're a little bit OCD and you want to make sure that naming convention is applied before it even, jumps into a folder, you can do that. It's also got a great thing where it can apply prefixes or suffixes to the name. So you might put QC as a prefix in front of all the families that nobody's looked at yet. You're basically saying, hey, quality control person, look this over. And when it matches the standards, when you fixed it up or you approve of it, remove the QC from the name. So CTC Family Exporter is going to be a great tool to be able to do this even better, even though, the manual way is fairly automated. Let me check and see where we are on that export. Hey, it's done. All right. Let me take a look. Of course, it's underneath this. All right, hang on. I got to break my presentation here to jump to the folder real quick to make a point. All right, we're on the harvesting slide. We'll come back to it. So we had a Revit stuff folder here. Check it out. It spit out every family. It got 82 families here. One of the first things I'm going to do is click on the size and sort it so big things are at the top. If you're a BIM manager, this is amazing right here. So what this lets me do, Autodesk says you have a problem if your family is over 500K. It's too big. Now it'll still run, but if you've ever had projects that chug, that problem right there, that's probably one of the main components. So what I like to do is look and see which one Autodesk says are an issue. And there's a lot that are just over the 500K line, but there's some gross offenders here. So we might just look at these gross offenders, open each one of them, put them in sort of this problem child subfolder, and see how we can purge them, remove all the extra materials that maybe a manufacturer baked in. A lot of times, I'll throw interior design companies under the bus. If you get something from Hayworth, they've got every SKU of that chair, and they've got geometry, just millions of edges that are all baked into one family, and you don't need them all. You just want, one configuration of that. So you got to kind of carefully erase and purge some things out of these really large files like this. All right. One other thing I like to do when it's in this folder is go to view extra large icons. Hey. And now, even though all this stuff is thrown into one folder, this is going to help me to see, oh yeah, that was a great family, or this is junk, or I didn't need that. And to choose, how you might want to sort these things out or leave them behind and delete them. You can normally tell at a glance, particularly if you're the PM and you're acquainted with this family, This will help you make some value judgments if you need to add a little bit more QA process before someone gets in and grades them and evaluates them and eventually hosts them. So hopefully that was helpful to show you guys, how to manually spit that out. That's already included in Revit. You can already, do that today. All right, let me start my slideshow back up here. Of course it's backwards. You guys can see. Yes, I read. Sue me. It keeps me from going off on tangents. All right, let me fast forward back to the harvester. Oop, too far. Okay. So I've shown you how to do it manually. I've mentioned about the CTC family exporter. I've also mentioned how you can have your PM choose the hero families of the project. This one's pretty minimally invasive. It's basically just reminding your PM, hey, could you save out the families that you guys either created yourself or you went and found and you modified to work? But what's neat about this is you can also incentivize this. So think carrot rather than stick, right? So we've got last 2 points here. You can have healthy competitions. You can also encourage this with bounties. I'll tell you, being a PM, the best thing I can get is just an attaboy from either my boss and my coworkers. Like, people think that I make neat stuff and I help the team. That little bit of praise or thanks, that's really all I need. But if you want to take it farther, if you've got someone that's contributing a lot of content and you want to reward, high contributors, you can offer $25 Amazon gift cards. And, at their hourly rate, you're basically saying, your break even is you saved us 25 minutes of time. You've saved the whole team 25 minutes of time. So that's worth us to pay you this gift card here. 'Tis the season. All right, so there are numerous categories of system families. Now, system families are different because they cannot be saved out as RFA files or .rfa files. And so the only way to make a new system family is to edit type. You select one, edit type, and duplicate an already existing family. And for this reason, one cannot erase all system families from of a type from a project. So one is forced to keep one of each of the type for future duplication. So you can't get rid of all of your walls. You got to keep one, or else how would you make a new one, right? So this makes curating them very challenging, and it makes disseminating them difficult. So how's your team going to get them if not from a previous project? You've got a couple of options here. But some of the things specifically that we're talking about with system families are going to be, some of them are actually views, but we've got drafting view details. You've got schedules. So those two are views. And then for system families, you got walls. That's a big one. That's actually the biggest one. Floors, ceilings, roofs, stairs, railings, ramps, storefront, curtain wall systems, and curtain wall mullions. There's probably a couple more, but those are the ones that architects tend to care about. So those can't be saved out. Well, not automatically, and then not by default, and not just with vanilla Revit. So what most firms do, if they don't have a content management solution, and the best practice is to create a container project. And you might just call it container project, or some firms have so much system family content, they might make walls.rvt as a project. And inside of walls.rvt are 80 little chunks of walls that are lined up like you're grocery shopping at Target, right? They're just kind of clustered together. So the brick walls are over here. And that's great because users can just simply select the walls they want and then copy and paste them directly into their project. And that's pretty easy. There's still wastefulness. It's not nearly as wasteful as them having to go to a previous project and look around and guess. That's real wasteful. But the wasteful part of it is they're still going to, like, if we're looking for a brick wall of a particular kind, and there happen to be 15 of those, I'm going to look at some obvious things on them. Okay, that one's got a soldier course near the top baked into it. That's cool. That one's got some kind of a water table 3 feet up, I think. But you got to click on them and look at their structure and actually determine how it's different from other ones and if it's the one you need. And so there is time spent still kind of interrogating each of the system families to be able to do that. The copy paste process is not hard, obviously, but it's the time that you spend looking in it and in its organization, and then trying to figure out if it's the thing you need or how much work it needs. Don't put all of your system families in the Revit template file. I see this frequently. It's normally a problem with walls. People will put in 80 wall types inside the Revit template, and then their users complain they can't find the wall type that they need. And man, some firms uniquely number their wall types. Oh, that's a wall type 962. Wow. So you require your users to memorize a number scheme, but some firms do that, and it works really well for them if they do that. It's terrible for the new person. It takes them like a year to get used to that number scheme. So there are better ways to do this, I promise you. So if you do a container project, you also can store views inside of that. So you could actually store in your drafting details. If you've got standard EPDM roof details, curb details, roof penetration details, that kind of stuff that you guys created back in the AutoCAD Stone Age, and then you created smart Revit details, then you can go to View, Insert from File, Insert Views from File, and bring those over. You also can do, with some elements, you can do Manage Transfer Project Standards. And in parentheses, I've kind of got some things to be aware of in this. So the thing to be aware of is when you do transfer project standards, it brings over all of those. And so you might have to then turn around and look at a bunch of things and delete a bunch. And then copy paste allows you to bring over individual system family elements. Here's another software solution. If you look into a content management solution, I've listed a specific one on here. Since this is an AIA talk, full disclosure, ATG sells CTC tools. And so I happen to know these tools and know that they've got a solution, but there basically are three large CMS or content management solutions that you guys should be looking at. They tend to not cost much either, which is great. But Hive, Avail, and Unify, I think, are the ones you should take a look at. I'm not mad at you if you choose any of those. They're all going to be better than you trying to maintain a folder structure and strict naming conventions, and then realizing, oh wait, this light kind of needs to be in 3 different subfolders technically. Now maybe it's got a CSI division number and we'll put it there, but how many of your users know to look there? And so now I've got to decide, are we just going to put it in one folder, or am I going to try to maintain it in 3 folders? And then when I need to improve it, replace it, delete it, I got to remember where all it occurs. So there's kind of a mess if you're tied up in folder structure. Plus, if you got users that are working from home, you got to have some way to, VPN to that content or something. So yeah, a CMS is going to be a much more recommended approach for setting up system families. Here's something that's awesome that I can tell you about Hive is I said that there's no way to save out individual .rfa files. Hive can take your system families and thumbnail them and discretely archive each of them. So if you got 80 walls, you can have 80 thumbnails of your wall types and make them searchable with those tags that your users add, which is just amazing. I mean, seriously, you just double click a wall and then it launches the wall command in Revit with that wall type jumped in and ready to model it. All right, we're towards the end here. We've rounded the corner. So we've talked about what our problems are or what we're up against. We talked about how to build a library, some of the things that you need to look at improving and such and bringing over to it. We talked about QA, QC process. On all these topics, again, there is more in the book. I have covered, out of those 2 chapters, kind of out of the middle of it, though, we have kind of covered a lot of ground in this talk. And then we also discussed several workflows for harvesting families. We talked about the manual process for doing it. We talked about a tool to automate that. We talked about your system families and how you could do a container project, or how you could point something like Hive to a project and it can scarf up all of the system families immediately. And I do recommend that. But you've got lots of options, some of them free, some of them cost to automate. For our main conclusion, we want you guys to be able to produce a plan that deliberately harvests Revit families from your ongoing projects. So we want this to be something that's very clear to your team, what needs to be done and what's expected to be done, and very clear checklist of what they need to do to make that happen. Like the file, save as library families, if you do it manually. So this concludes the webinar, how to build your Revit library from ongoing projects. I mentioned before, like at the top of this, if your firm has had a successful process for harvesting families, think about what you're doing from your ongoing projects. Please take a minute and summarize and share that in the chat. Don't write a novel. I've already done that. But give us something about what you've experienced. But first, I'm going to take a look into our chat and see what has queued up. Also, I've got the link for that white paper up on screen, and that's I don't know if you guys have kids that saw How to Train a Dragon, but when they saw How to Train Your Revit Library, they decided to make the title card match that. So it does look like that if you go to our website to download that. All right, Brian Weeks is on. Let's see, Ryan Davis says, a lot of these processes seem to be for larger firms who have the budget to allocate time for this amount or quality organization. What processes would you recommend for a small firm is trying to take control of their QA/QC regarding the Revit family library? Ryan, you were right. Most firms are just one or two people, and so they tend to not be large firms. They still need to do QA/QC processes for themselves. They've got it easier, though, because they answer to themselves or them plus a couple of other people, and they already know what those people are thinking about, how they need things organized. And the content seems to be less when it's a small firm. Large firms generate just enormous amounts of content, and the problem with them typically is how do we organize it? And that's kind of another separate issue, in spending the appropriate amount of time organizing content, which, man, architecture firms are just not spending the time doing that. So your QA/QC process for a small firm or for a sole proprietor can be very simple. It can just be every time I do, if it's just me, I'm a sole proprietor, which most of ATG's customers are, then I'm going to keep it really simple. And I am going to basically resolve that before I do each project, I'm going to save out all of these files, and then I'm going to spend this much time sorting them into these folders, and then I'm going to run an automated grading system on them. And then, definitely by this date, I will, phase in kind of a loop back where I come back and determine which of those things actually need to be fixed. And then I'm going to fix them or triage them. And some of these I won't fix until next quarter or, whenever. And so if you've got kind of a slower quarter, you might kind of push some of this work to then so that you're not, of course, there is no slow quarter. Who am I kidding, right? Even in COVID, everybody's like, we're so busy. But you have to, part of this process is carving out expectation and time. And in that sense, it doesn't matter whether or not you've got a BIM manager that can do it, or it's just you. It's still someone with a plan, expecting it of all the team members. And also, actually, yeah, Jose kind of has a similar comment, small and large firms, it takes time to organize. That is kind of the thing, right? And I like that Brian's speaking to some of this as well, and I love the discussion we're having here. Sometimes it's just you, and you don't have to, and you still need to formalize it. You still need to, before I say I'm finished with this project, just because I saved out a bunch of PDFs and transferred them doesn't mean I'm finished yet. There's still project closeout that I do, and I make sure that I do these things prior to considering it archived. All right, what else we got? So Brian also says, for small firms, have your PMs focus on their projects initially. I know we wear a lot of hats already, but if you include this task as part of the closeout workflow, it can help. Okay. And Brian also says, don't try to curate your entire project library at once. Yeah, no kidding. We have a lot of customers that are like, here's our pile of stuff. You tell us how to scope this thing, because it's part of it is, that same old question of how do you eat an elephant, right? And so we've got, there is something neat about contracting it out where someone is going to not put it off. We're contracted to get in, figure out just how big your Division 12 furnishings are. Are there 50 or are there 65 families in there? We're going to automate the grading. We're going to figure out what's wrong with them. We're going to tell you what we find and say, I don't recommend we fix these couple because they're a mess and you could do better. But we probably do need to fix these. Here's some screenshots of them. And just kind of interact with some of your BIM users. But if you wait for other people's input, man, that's kind of one of those things that drags it out. So we tend to, if ATG is assisting, we tend to make it where if you see it differently or you don't want us doing this, just let us know in Teams or however we're interacting with your team. David, I appreciate it. Appreciate the feedback, and also thanks to again for AIA St. Louis's input in this. We hope to be able to offer more LUs to you guys and cover subjects that you care about. This one happens to be a passion project of mine. In fact, I've had some other talks in the area around some of these subjects, and hopefully been opening people's eyes to processes they should implement, or at least read about them academically in the white paper, and resolve that maybe in 2022, as part of our January leadership initiatives, we'll start getting serious about some of these. All right, Walter says, I started doing many of the same processes you discussed in the seminar about 10 years ago. Our detailing on small commercial and residential projects has been reduced by 75% with organized libraries. That's a big deal. Wow, because you think about how much time you spend detailing something, or as a more senior member of your team at that higher hourly rate, drawing it over for some new knucklehead that doesn't know how to do it. That's an incredible amount of time that you've got to spend. Meanwhile, the older detail person that's drawing out is thinking, we already solved this problem back in AutoCAD. Why don't these Revit users have this? It's because no one thought it was okay to spend the time to do the proper archiving work. They thought it would be overhead. They thought they'd be in trouble. They didn't have a process. They didn't have a place to put it. They didn't have the software to do it or the software to automate it. All the problems we talked about, but that's all solvable stuff. We can stop burning one day a week, mired down in terrible processes. Ryan, I appreciate you too, man. All right. Brian also says, having a tool that can extract and organize your families at once can definitely help. Of course, Brian's going to recommend CTC software. He's anything to mention them, right? Some of the tools are free though, so if you're looking at like a 14-day trial, worth it, if you get to keep using that tool in perpetuity. All right. Ryan asks, could CTC make a Revit tool that allows us to override crop region line weights in a view? That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I don't work directly with CTC, but that's kind of one of those things. Like if you have the CTC software tools and you click on feature request, like if you have a tool that you think, oh, this thing ought to do it, and View Creator, right? That should do it, or Type Swapper. I don't know which one would be more applicable, but if you think that feature belongs as part of it, it absolutely has a feature request. And you can post that, and they aggregate those, and they, weigh those against what other people in the industry are asking for. And then they probably reference, how hard is that thing to do, and, how many hours, and what's the payoff, or I don't know what their thought process is, but yeah, absolutely. Ryan, you could make that suggestion directly to them, and they do look at that stuff. It's not like Autodesk where you have, your Autodesk crashed. You want to send a report? Sure. Yes. They need to know. Yeah, maybe they saw that. Maybe not. All right. Pauline asks, how can we get this webinar copy? Pauline, if you can wait a couple of days, we're going to host it on our YouTube page, which we do all our webinars. So if you guys just did a Google search for YouTube, atgusa.com or ATGUSA, you will find our site. Like, subscribe, ring that bell, all of that stuff. Then this webinar will be available. But yeah, this conversation typically needs to involve leadership. And if you've heard some things that spurred your thoughts about how to get organized or put a plan together, and you need someone else to, hear this out, then that would be a good resource to be able to point them to that link and say, hey, check this out. This guy raises some good points. We need a library. All right, Jose says the CTC Family Explorer, Family Loader, and Family Checker are really helpful. Yes, they are. And there's lots of tools in that BIM Manager suite for fixing families, for taking crummy parameters and swapping them out for your shared parameters. If you're kind of more of an advanced user, there's some automated stuff in that end of it too. All right. Walter says, I would recommend CTC also. Look at this. Everybody's corporate shill. That's great. I tried manually editing in Revit for 6 years. Walter, I'm sorry. I called you a corporate shill. I should own that. I steered you guys towards CTC. That's my fault. If you can do it in free tools, if PyRevit does something or some other kind of free tool, or you've got a Dynamo script, I am not mad at you. Just get a process in place that can help to kick families out and flag them or rename them. All right. And then Rick says, can you talk about the project template review that you can do? Sure. Yeah. We can't get into cost right now, Rick, but Rick, normally what I do for a template review, and honestly, most of them that I do is because the template was created by someone that doesn't work at the firm anymore. And the firm's like, I don't even know if this is a good template. It's complicated. I don't know if it's a good template, or everybody complains about how it's missing all this stuff, or the stuff that's there is hard to find, or geez, why do we have 37 line styles? Shouldn't we just have 8? That's the kind of stuff that it's like emotional stuff that normally makes the firm say, we need to reevaluate our template. We got people on staff that can make a template for sure, but there is something nice about having a third party kind of step in with expertise and say, look, I don't have a dog in this fight, as we might say in Arkansas, but here's some things that you might consider improving in your template. And then you guys could take that and act upon it on your own time. Or you could say, how much would it cost for you guys to actually, you have our template, how much would it take for you to do this? How many hours would that be? So normally we kind of, as far as pricing, again, I can't speak to a specific number. We don't have a set number, but we normally are going to phase that where we spend typically about 16 hours reviewing a template and writing a paper about it. So it's not a quick get out thing. We've got a checklist of things that we exhaustively check against, and we know what the industry's doing. And so when we don't see that, we're like, well, consider doing this. So normally that review is going to land somewhere around 16, 20 hours ish. Then the question of how much to fix it is different. It's more hours normally, but you can triage that. You can choose some bang for your buck on that one too. So basically, any kind of service you guys are thinking about, man, I wish if we just had more time. We have the expertise, we just don't have the time. ATG probably provides that service. If we don't, just ask, hey, do you do this? And the answer is probably yes, we do. All right. Yeah, so that's the template review process. I agree, Ryan. PyRevit does some great stuff. I'll plug them too. It's just free software. You should get PyRevit. The best thing that I enjoy about it is being able to draw a hatch. Like if I want to make a model hatch as opposed to a drafting hatch, and I just draw that line pattern over some rock work that I got from Coronado or something, I can draw that line work on a image tile and then just grab all that line work and say, create a hatch from that. And it will either spit out a .pat file for me to push into our standards or to, send to somebody to use in their project. Or usually I just do it right there in the project. So the project I'm in, I will create a PAT file. Sometimes I'll do that in the template file. If we're short on wood grains or we're short on stone, that tends to be the areas where people just don't have enough hatches to express all of the possible designs that they tend to want to do. All right. Great discussion, guys, by the way. Appreciate it. We are just over on time, 2 minutes over. It's pretty hard to land a plane exactly on the hour. Appreciate all the feedback. In a couple of days, check it on YouTube and you'll be able to send out a link. Appreciate all the responses. We'll see you guys next time.